I used to think that talking every day meant something. At the time, it felt obvious. If two people speak every day, check in every morning, send messages before bed, that must mean the connection is real, that it's alive, that something important is happening between them. At least that's what I told myself. I'm not even sure when that belief started forming in my head. Probably slowly. Probably because it felt comforting to believe it. Because when you see someone's name on your phone every single day, it creates this quiet sense of continuity. Like something steady is happening. Like something is building. And for a while, it really did feel like that. When we first started talking, it didn't feel intense or dramatic. It actually felt simple. We met through a mutual friend at a small gathering. Nothing special about the night. Just a few people sitting around someone's living room, talking about work, complaining about rent, the usual stuff. She wasn't the loudest person in the room, not the center of attention, but when she spoke, people listened. Not because she demanded it, more because she seemed present. I remember noticing that. The way she asked questions that didn't feel automatic. She would pause and wait for real answers instead of moving on quickly like most people do in group conversations. At some point, we ended up sitting next to each other. I don't even remember exactly how, but I remember the first thing she asked me. What do you do when you're not working? Not, what do you do for work? That felt different. I told her the truth, that I spent a lot of time walking around the city with headphones in, that sometimes I'd sit in coffee shops longer than necessary, that I liked observing people more than participating most of the time. She laughed softly and said she did something similar. Not exactly the same, just similar enough that it felt familiar. The conversation moved easily after that. Nothing heavy, nothing too personal, just small things that felt surprisingly comfortable to say out loud. And when the night ended, she said something simple. Text me when you get home. It wasn't dramatic, but it stuck with me. The next day, we started messaging. At first, it was the normal kind of back and forth people have when they're just getting to know each other. Did you survive work today? Barely. Same. Little jokes. Random observations. Photos of coffee cups and cloudy skies and things that weren't particularly meaningful. But they kept coming. Morning messages. Midday check-ins. Good night texts. And I remember thinking how natural it felt. There was no pressure to keep the conversation alive. It just kept moving on its own. One message would lead to another, then another. Then suddenly it was midnight, and we were still talking about something completely unnecessary. Sometimes we'd realize hours had passed without either of us noticing. And that felt exciting, not in a loud way. More like discovering a quiet place where time moved differently. After a few weeks, it became routine. I'd wake up and check my phone before even getting out of bed. Most mornings there was already a message from her. Something small. Did you sleep okay? Or, I had the weirdest dream. Sometimes it was just a meme or a picture of her dog sitting on the couch. And I started responding automatically. Not because I had to, because it felt normal. Expected. Like the day didn't fully begin until we'd exchanged a few messages. We didn't talk about serious things much in the beginning. Just everyday life. What she was eating. What I was listening to. Complaints about work. Stories about coworkers. The kinds of conversations people usually forget right after they happen. But the frequency made them feel important. Because even though the topics were small, the connection felt constant. At some point, we started calling each other in the evenings. Usually while doing other things. She'd call while cooking dinner. I'd call while walking home from work. We'd talk about whatever came to mind. Sometimes we'd sit in silence for a minute or two, both distracted by something in our own apartments. But the silence didn't feel awkward. It felt shared, like we were occupying the same space without actually being there. I remember telling a friend once that talking to her felt easy. That word again. Easy. At the time, I thought that meant something good. Maybe it did. For a while. We started seeing each other more often after that. Coffee on weekends. Late-night walks through quiet streets. Occasional dinners where we stayed long enough that the restaurant staff started stacking chairs nearby. Those moments felt real. They felt different from the messages. More grounded. But strangely, the messaging still remained the center of everything. Because when we weren't together, we were still talking. Constantly. And I think that constant communication created an illusion I didn't fully understand at the time. It made it feel like we knew everything about each other. Like nothing was hidden. Like there was no distance between us. But the truth is, we rarely talked about anything that actually mattered. Not at first. Not really. We talked every day, sometimes for hours. But most of those conversations floated on the surface of our lives. work stress, movies, what we ate, which cafe had the best pastries, things like that. And I didn't notice anything strange about that. Because when someone is present in your life every single day, it starts to feel like intimacy automatically exists. Even when the conversations stay light. Even when deeper questions never really appear. I think the first time I sensed something slightly off was during a late-night call. We had been talking for almost 2 hours, jumping from topic to topic the way we always did. Music, travel, random childhood memories. And then there was a pause. Not awkward, just quiet. And I asked her something simple. What are you actually afraid of? It wasn't meant to be heavy. It just came out. And there was a long silence. Longer than usual. She laughed softly and said something like, I don't know. Spiders maybe. Then she changed the subject. At the time I didn't push it. I let the conversation move on. But I remember lying in bed after we hung up and thinking about that moment. Because we had been talking every day for months. And yet, that question felt strangely unfamiliar. Like we had been circling around deeper things without ever stepping into them. I didn't think much about it after that. Life kept moving. Messages kept arriving. Calls kept happening. Days kept passing in that same rhythm. But something subtle had shifted in my awareness. Once you notice a pattern, it becomes harder to ignore it. And I started realizing that whenever the conversation drifted near something personal, we both seemed to move away from it. Not dramatically, just gently, almost automatically, like two people walking around a puddle without acknowledging it. Months went by like that, talking every day, laughing, sharing little pieces of daily life. But the deeper parts of ourselves stayed strangely untouched. I told myself that maybe it would come later, that intimacy takes time, that some people open up slowly, and that explanation made sense. So I kept going, because on the surface, everything looked good. Two people connected, two people talking constantly, two people who seemed close. But sometimes, late at night, I would notice something strange. After hours of conversation, after all the messages and calls, I still felt like I didn't truly know her. Not in the way I expected. I knew what kind of coffee she liked. I knew her favorite shows. I knew the names of her co-workers. But the deeper layers, the things that shape a person, stayed slightly out of reach. And I started wondering if she felt the same about me. Maybe she did. Maybe she didn't. We never talked about it. Which, now that I think about it, might have been the whole point. The realization didn't come suddenly. It crept in slowly, like a quiet understanding forming in the background of ordinary conversations. One evening, we were texting while I was sitting on my couch. She told me about something that happened at work. I responded with a joke. She laughed. Then she sent another message about dinner plans. And suddenly it hit me. We had been talking every day for almost a year. And somehow, we had never really said anything real. Not once. Not clearly. Not honestly. Just fragments of daily life. Floating back and forth. Filling space. Keeping the connection alive, but never deepening it. That thought stayed with me for a long time. Even as the messages kept coming. Even as the routine continued. Because once you see something like that, you can't fully unsee it. And sometimes I wonder if she noticed it too. Or if she was comfortable with the way things were. Maybe the surface was enough for her. Maybe it was enough for both of us for a while. But eventually, something about it started to feel empty. Not broken. Not painful. Just hollow in a quiet way. Like two people sitting across from each other, talking for hours, without ever actually saying what matters. And by the time I understood that feeling clearly, it was already too late to ask the questions I should have asked much earlier. Now when I think about that time, what stays with me isn't the conversations themselves. It's the silence underneath them. The things we never said. The things we never asked. All those daily messages. All those hours on the phone. And somehow, almost nothing real inside them. Which still feels strange to admit. Because if someone looked at our phones back then, they would see thousands of messages. Proof that we talked constantly. Proof that we were connected. But they wouldn't see the space between the words. And that space is where everything important lived. Or maybe where everything important was missing. I still don't know which one is true. And maybe that's why I keep thinking about it sometimes. Late at night. When everything is quiet again. Trying to understand how two people can talk every single day. And still never really say anything at all. The strange thing is, nothing about it felt fake while it was happening. That's the part one keep coming back to. If it had felt shallow from the beginning, I probably would have noticed sooner. I probably would have stepped back. Maybe even ended it before it became something routine. But it didn't feel shallow. It felt active. Alive. When someone messages you every morning and every night, when your phone lights up with their name multiple times a day, it creates this quiet illusion that something meaningful must be forming. Because attention feels like intimacy. At least it did to me. Our conversations kept flowing the way they always had. Work stories, random thoughts, memes, little complaints about daily life. Sometimes we'd send voice notes instead of texting, especially late at night, when both of us were too tired to type long messages. Her voice would sound softer then, slower. Sometimes she'd trail off mid-sentence, like she forgot what she was saying. And I'd laugh and say something like, "You're half asleep." She'd laugh too, and we'd keep talking. At the time, those moments felt close, like we were sharing something private. But looking back now, I realize we were sharing time, not ourselves. And those two things aren't always the same. There was a night I remember more clearly than the others. I was sitting on the floor of my living room with my laptop open, half watching a movie while texting her. She had just gotten home from work. She told me she was exhausted. We started talking about what we were both doing. She was heating up leftovers. I was trying to finish a project I had been avoiding all week. The conversation kept drifting in and out of focus the way it usually did. One message every few minutes, sometimes longer pauses. Then she asked me something simple. "What are you thinking about right now?" I stared at the phone for a moment. Not because the question was complicated, because it felt unfamiliar. We had talked for months, maybe hundreds of hours. But that kind of question almost never appeared. And I remember typing something safe. Just tired from work. Which was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. Because what I had actually been thinking about was us. About the strange rhythm we had built. About the way we filled so many hours talking without ever touching the deeper parts of our lives. I didn't say that. I sent the easier answer. And she responded with something equally light. Same. I might fall asleep early tonight. And just like that, the moment passed. It happened like that over and over again. Small openings. Tiny opportunities for something real to surface. And both of us stepping around them without fully realizing it. Or maybe we did realize. Maybe that was the quiet agreement we never spoke about. Stay here, on the surface, where everything feels easy. At some point, I started noticing how predictable our conversations had become. Not boring exactly, just familiar. We could almost anticipate each other's responses. If I complained about work, she would say something supportive. If she mentioned being stressed, I'd send a joke to lighten the mood. If either of us had a good day, we'd celebrate it briefly before drifting back into normal conversation. Everything worked. Everything functioned. But there was a strange absence of curiosity. We weren't asking new questions anymore. We weren't discovering new layers of each other. We were just maintaining the connection we had already built. And that maintenance felt good enough for a long time. I remember talking to a friend about her once. He asked me something simple. "So what's she really like?" And I paused. Not because I didn't like her. Not because I didn't care about her. But because the answer felt harder than I expected. I could describe her habits. Her humor. Her taste in music. The way she liked her coffee. But when I tried to describe who she really was, the deeper part of her personality, my mind went strangely blank. It felt like trying to describe a place you've visited many times, but only ever walked through the same two streets. That realization stayed in the back of my mind. Not loud enough to interrupt the rhythm we had, but present enough that I couldn't ignore it completely. Sometimes I would think about asking her something deeper, something real. But then the conversation would drift back into familiar territory. And I would let it, because disrupting the rhythm felt strangely uncomfortable. Looking back now, I think we were both protecting something. Not consciously, but instinctively. Real conversations require vulnerability. And vulnerability changes things. Once someone reveals something honest about themselves, the relationship moves into a different space. You can't easily return to the comfortable surface after that. Maybe we both sensed that. Maybe we both preferred the safety of daily conversation over the risk of deeper connection. But something subtle started changing in me after a while. The routine that once felt comforting started feeling repetitive. Not empty exactly, just incomplete. Like eating the same meal every day. You might enjoy it at first, but eventually you start noticing what's missing. One evening I caught myself staring at our message history, scrolling back through months of conversations. Hundreds, maybe thousands of messages. Jokes, photos, voice notes, fragments of everyday life. And I realized something strange. If you removed all the timestamps, if you mixed the messages together, It would be almost impossible to tell when any of them happened, because they all sounded the same. Same tone, same topics, same emotional distance. That thought stayed with me, quietly, for days, maybe weeks. I didn't say anything about it, because technically nothing was wrong. We still talked every day. We still laughed. We still cared about each other in some way. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we had built something that looked like intimacy without actually reaching it. Eventually, the routine started shifting slightly. Not dramatically, just small changes. Sometimes a message would arrive later than usual. Sometimes a conversation would end earlier. Sometimes a whole afternoon would pass without either of us reaching out. And when that happened, I noticed something surprising. Instead of feeling anxious, I felt relieved. Not because I didn't want to talk to her, but because the silence felt honest. For the first time in a long time, there was space. Space where the conversation usually lived. And in that space, I could finally hear my own thoughts more clearly. One night, I asked myself a question I had been avoiding. If we stopped talking tomorrow, what would actually disappear from my life? The answer wasn't simple. Because she was present in my routine. Her messages shaped my days. Her voice was familiar. But when I looked deeper, I realized something uncomfortable. I didn't actually know how she felt about the things that mattered most. Her fears, her regrets, her real dreams. The parts of a person that defined them. Those parts remained mostly untouched. And I realized something else too. She probably didn't know those parts of me either. Not really. Not beyond the surface explanations I had offered. Because every time the conversation approached something deeper, I had redirected it just as much as she had. That realization wasn't painful. It was just quiet. Like noticing a detail in a picture you've looked at 1,000 times. Something obvious that somehow escaped your attention before. Eventually, our conversations became less frequent. Gradually. Naturally. There was no argument. No confrontation. No moment where we decided to stop. The messages just slowed. Then slowed again. Until they were no longer part of my daily routine. The strange thing is, I didn't feel heartbroken. I felt thoughtful. Reflective. Like I had just finished reading a long book and was trying to understand what it was actually about. Sometimes I still think about those months. All the conversations. All the messages. All the time we spent talking. And I wonder if either of us realized what was happening while it was happening. Or if we were both simply following the rhythm that felt easiest. Because in a strange way, we were close. Just not in the way I thought we were. We shared time, attention, routine. But we never really shared the parts of ourselves that changed the shape of a relationship. And without those parts, everything stayed light, easy, comfortable, but also temporary. Now, when I look back on it, what surprises me most isn't that it ended. It's that it lasted as long as it did. Two people talking every single day, and somehow, never really saying anything real. I still can't fully explain how that happens, but I know now that it's possible, because I lived it. And sometimes, late at night, when I scroll through old messages I forgot to delete, I can still see it clearly. All those words, all that conversation, and the quiet space between them where something deeper might have existed. If either of us had been brave enough to say it first. Sometimes I try to remember the exact moment when the rhythm started slowing down. Not the final message. Not the last call. Those moments feel less important now. What I keep going back to is something quieter, something that probably didn't seem significant at the time. Because that's how these things usually shift. Not with a clear ending. More like a change in temperature you only notice after the room has already cooled. There was a week when our conversation started coming a little later than usual. Nothing dramatic. Just small delays. A message in the afternoon instead of the morning. A reply in the evening instead of right away. At first I didn't think anything of it. People get busy. Work piles up. Days get messy. That's normal. And I told myself that. More than once. But something about the pauses felt different. Not uncomfortable. Just unfamiliar. Because for so long we had been part of each other's daily rhythm. Like background noise you stop noticing. And once that noise fades, you suddenly realize how quiet everything actually is. One night, I caught myself reaching for my phone automatically. Not because it buzzed. Just because my body expected it to. That had become such a normal reflex. Wake up, check for her message. Lunch break, send something small. Before bed, say goodnight. When that rhythm broke, I didn't feel sad. At least not right away. What I felt first was confusion. Like when you walk into a room expecting someone to be there, and realize they left without you noticing. We still talked during that time. Just less often. And when we did, the conversations felt slightly different. More direct, more efficient. We exchanged updates about our lives, work, plans, things happening during the week. But the playful, drifting conversations we used to have were becoming rarer. Not gone, just fading. And I found myself wondering something I hadn't asked before. Were we ever actually that close? Or were we just good at filling empty space with conversation? That question sat in my mind longer than I expected, because it challenged something I had believed for months. That talking constantly meant something deeper was happening. But now I wasn't so sure. Sometimes people talk because they're curious. Sometimes they talk because they're lonely. And sometimes they talk because silence feels uncomfortable. I wasn't sure which category we belonged to anymore. Maybe we had moved between all three without noticing. I remember one evening when we finally spoke on the phone again after a few days of only texting. Her voice sounded the same. Familiar, warm, but something about the conversation felt slightly distant. Not cold, just careful, like both of us were aware that the rhythm had changed but didn't want to acknowledge it directly. We talked about work, about a new cafe she tried, about a show I had started watching. Normal things, safe things, but the pauses between topics were longer, and I realized something during those silences. For the first time in months, neither of us was trying to keep the conversation alive. Before, if a topic faded, one of us would immediately bring up something new. A question, a story, a joke. But that night, we let the quiet exist. Eventually, she said she was tired and needed to sleep. I said I understood. We said goodnight. And when the call ended, I didn't feel the urge to send another message, which surprised me, because for months that urge had always been there. A final text, a small continuation, something to keep the connection open. But that night, I just put the phone down. The next morning I woke up without checking my phone immediately. That felt strange too, like breaking a habit you didn't realize had become automatic. When I finally looked at the screen later in the day, there was no message from her. And for the first time, that absence didn't feel like something missing. It just felt like space. Days passed, then more days. We still talked occasionally, but the constant thread between us had loosened, and neither of us seemed to be pulling it tight again. At some point I stopped expecting her messages, and I imagine she stopped expecting mine. There was no conversation about ending things. No discussion about distance. No explanation. Just a gradual understanding forming on both sides. Whatever we had built, it had run its natural course. I thought I might feel regret when that realization fully settled in. But what I felt instead was something closer to clarity. Not about her. About the experience itself. Because I finally understood something that had been confusing me for months. Talking every day doesn't automatically create intimacy. It can create familiarity, routine, comfort. But real connection requires something else. Something riskier. Something we never quite reached. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if one of us had pushed the conversation deeper earlier. If I had asked the harder questions. If she had shared something more vulnerable. Maybe the relationship would have changed. Maybe it would have grown into something more real. Or maybe it would have ended sooner. There's no way to know now. But I don't think either of us was ready for that kind of honesty at the time. It's easier to talk about daily life. Easier to stay where things feel light. Easier to keep things pleasant and predictable. And sometimes, two people can live in that space together for a very long time. Every now and then I still see her name pop up somewhere. A photo online. A comment from a mutual friend. Just small reminders that she exists in the world somewhere. Living her life the same way I'm living mine. And when that happens, I don't feel sadness. I just feel a strange sense of familiarity. Like seeing someone you once spoke to every day, but never truly met. What stays with me the most isn't the ending. It's the realization that connection can sometimes look very convincing from the outside. Two people talking constantly, sharing time, sharing attention, but still leaving the most important parts of themselves untouched. I don't blame her for that. And I don't blame myself either. Sometimes people meet each other at the exact level they're ready for. No deeper, no shallower, just enough to keep the conversation going. We talked every day. That part is true. But when I think about those months now, what stands out isn't the words we exchanged. It's the things that never found their way into those conversations. The fears, the doubts, the real questions. All the things that could have changed the shape of what we were. And maybe that's the quiet truth of it. We had a connection built almost entirely out of daily conversation. But conversation alone isn't the same as understanding. And understanding is the part that makes something last. Now, sometimes when I meet someone new and the messages start coming every day again, I notice something I didn't notice before. The difference between talking and actually saying something real. And that awareness sits quietly in the background of every new conversation, not as a warning, just as a reminder that thousands of messages can exist between two people and still leave the most important words unsaid. Sometimes I think that was the real story, not the talking, not even the ending, just two people sharing time for a while, without ever stepping into the deeper parts of themselves. And somehow, both of us being okay with that for longer than we probably should have been. Until eventually the conversation slowed down, and the silence underneath it finally had space to be heard.